How do you shatter a fortress without marching an army to its gates? On the very morning Putin wanted the world to see control, Ukraine sent fire and smoke into his own home city and turned safety into a myth. If you want more deep stories that cut through the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with the one friend who always wants the real meaning behind the headline. For years, Vladimir Putin relied on one quiet idea. The farther something was from the front, the safer it was. That idea shaped the way Russia fought this war. Critical ports stayed deep in the rear. Naval assets stayed far from Ukrainian reach. Prestige events continued in places that were supposed to feel untouchable. St. Petersburg mattered more than almost any other city in that system. It is Putin's hometown. It is a symbol of Russian power, culture, and history. It is also tied to the navy, trade, and national image. If Moscow is the political heart, St. Petersburg is something more personal. It is memory, prestige, and myth. That is why this strike mattered so much. According to Ukrainian and international reporting, drones reached targets around St. Petersburg on June 3rd, hitting an oil terminal and a naval site near Kronstadt, just as Russia's flagship economic forum was getting started. That timing changed everything. This was not just an attack on metal, fuel, or concrete. It was an attack on a story. The Kremlin wanted cameras pointed at polished halls, foreign guests, and speeches about resilience. Instead, those same hours brought smoke, flight disruptions, emergency responses, and a fresh question that Russia does not want investors, elites, or ordinary citizens asking out loud. If this place can be hit, what exactly is still safe? That question cuts deeper than the fire itself. Because war is not only about destruction, it is also about belief. Belief in power, belief in protection, belief that the state is in control. The strongest governments work hard to protect that image, especially during wartime. They know people can live with sacrifice longer than they can live with humiliation. They know citizens can endure shortages, fear, and tension if they still believe the center is strong. But once the center looks exposed, the damage spreads far beyond the blast zone. And St. Petersburg is not just any city to expose. Think about the symbolism. Putin was preparing for the event often called Russia's version of Davos, a forum designed to say that despite sanctions, despite war, despite isolation, Russia still has a future others should invest in. That was the stage. Then Ukraine placed a different image next to it. Black smoke over one of Russia's proudest cities, airport interruptions, mobile internet cut, and reports of a warship hit in dry dock near the historic base of the Baltic Fleet. One image said stability, the other said vulnerability. In modern conflict, the second image usually wins. What makes this even more striking is the distance. We are not talking about a target just behind the front. We are talking about a target more than 1,000 kilometers away. That matters because range is power. Range means the map is changing. Range means rear areas stop feeling rear. Range means a country now has to defend not just trenches and border regions, but symbolic centers, export routes, military repair sites, and political showcases all at once. And that creates a brutal strategic problem. Air defense is never infinite. Radar coverage is never perfect. Interceptors are never free. The more territory you must protect, the harder it becomes to protect anything well. If a state shifts systems closer to the front, deeper targets become more exposed. If it thickens defense around major cities and prestige sites, pressure grows elsewhere. Ukraine understands that. Long-range strikes do not need to destroy everything. Sometimes they only need to force impossible choices. That is one reason the target set here seems so carefully chosen. Start with the oil terminal. At first glance, some people hear oil terminal and think about a normal industrial site. But in wartime, fuel infrastructure is never just industrial. Fuel is movement. Fuel is logistics. Fuel is export revenue. Fuel is military life support. An oil terminal in the St. Petersburg area is not only a storage point, it is part of the system that turns Russian energy into cash and strategic endurance. That matters because energy revenue helps Russia absorb the weight of a long war. So when Ukraine hits a fuel-linked site, it is not simply chasing a dramatic fireball for social media. It is trying to raise risk, slow flows, increase costs, and inject uncertainty into a sector the Kremlin badly needs to keep looking stable. And uncertainty can be expensive even when damage is limited. That is one of the least understood parts of this war. People often imagine success only in terms of something being fully destroyed, but infrastructure can lose value before it is destroyed. Insurance prices can rise. Cargo decisions can change. Repair crews must be deployed. Security costs grow. Routes may be delayed. Operators begin to factor danger into every movement. One strike can echo through contracts, schedules, and confidence. Even if a facility returns to work quickly, the message remains. This place is now on the board. That message becomes even heavier when paired with the naval angle. Kronstadt is not just a dot on the map. It is deeply tied to Russian naval identity. More importantly, it has operational weight. Reports link the strike to a corvette called Boki in dry dock at the naval base there. Even if the ship was not sunk, and even if repairs remain possible, the point is larger than one vessel. A warship in dock is supposed to be in one of the safest places it can be. A repair center is supposed to restore readiness, not become part of the casualty list. If a ship can be struck there, then harbor stops feeling like harbor. That matters because fleets do not run on pride alone. They run on maintenance cycles, shipyard capacity, spare parts, technical crews, and predictable repair windows. Damage a ship at sea, and you have a combat problem. Damage a ship in dry dock, and you may have something worse, a systems problem. You are threatening the process that keeps multiple vessels operational over time. That is why strikes on repair nodes can punch above their size. It also lands hard psychologically, because Russia has already lived through this kind of lesson in the Black Sea. There too, areas once treated like secure anchors became dangerous. Naval posture had to shift. Assumptions had to change. The deeper point is not that the Baltic Fleet suddenly collapses tomorrow. The deeper point is that the idea of a safe Russian naval sanctuary keeps shrinking. First one sea feels exposed, then another. Once that pattern is established, commanders, planners, and politicians cannot unsee it, and ordinary people cannot unfeel it. That morning, the disruption did not stay limited to military imagery. Pulkovo Airport faced restrictions, flights were delayed or diverted, mobile internet was cut. That is another important piece of the story, because sometimes the defense against the strike becomes part of the strike's impact. When authorities shut networks to complicate drone navigation, daily life can break with them. Payments become harder, communication becomes weaker, movement becomes slower, confusion spreads faster than facts. A city hosting foreign guests suddenly looks less like a confident economic hub and more like a place bracing for intrusion. This is where the attack becomes bigger than tactics. It becomes political theater forced upon the Kremlin by its enemy. Putin wanted a scene of order. Ukraine created a scene of interruption. Putin wanted to say Russia could compartmentalize war and business. Ukraine blurred the line between them. Putin wanted foreign guests to feel they were arriving at a durable power center. Instead, they arrived under the shadow of emergency measures and smoke. And that contrast is deadly for image management. Authoritarian systems spend enormous energy controlling tempo. They want crises to appear far away, isolated, manageable, and temporary. They want prestige events to float above the ugliness. They want ordinary citizens to think the state absorbs shocks before shocks reach daily life. But long-range drone warfare keeps collapsing those walls. It is hard to maintain the image of perfect control when civilians hear explosions, airports pause, and the internet goes dark in one of the country's most important cities. If this breakdown between front and rear is becoming the new normal, then the real target is not only infrastructure. The real target is the Kremlin's confidence architecture. And confidence architecture matters in every layer of war. It matters for investors deciding whether risk is worth it. It matters for regional officials who do not want to look helpless. It matters for military planners trying to allocate scarce defenses. It matters for Russian citizens who have been told again and again that the war can be fought at a distance while core life remains stable. Every successful deep strike chips away at that promise. Not always in one dramatic collapse. More often in a slower erosion. A delayed flight here, a blackout there, a ration service somewhere else. A sense that the map no longer protects the center the way it used to. Here is the dangerous part for Moscow. Once people begin to expect disruption, every future warning feels larger. That changes behavior. Businesses add caution, families change travel plans. Officials overreact, security measures expand, public messaging grows more defensive. And each response can create its own cost. In that sense, a drone campaign can force a state into self-inflicted friction. The defending side spends more, restricts more, and worries more just to preserve the appearance of normal life. Normality starts costing a fortune. If this analysis is helping you see the war from a deeper angle, hit subscribe, press like, and send this video to someone who still thinks drone strikes are only about explosions. Now, we should slow down and stay honest. None of this means Russia is suddenly defenseless. It does not mean one strike decides the war. It does not mean every dramatic video equals strategic collapse. Russia still has size, depth, production, and the ability to adapt. It has moved assets before. It has repaired damaged infrastructure before. It has found workarounds under sanctions before. It still carries serious retaliatory power. And Ukraine, for all its growing reach, still faces its own shortages, air defense strain, and daily attacks from Russian missiles and drones. That balance matters, because strong analysis is not cheerleading. If we exaggerate every strike into a final turning point, we learn nothing. The smarter view is that the St. Petersburg operation reveals a trend. And the trend is this: Ukraine is becoming more capable of linking symbolism and strategy in the same attack. It is not just striking random distance for headlines. It is increasingly choosing targets that damage systems, create awkward optics, and force Russia to confront uncomfortable trade-offs at home. That is why the timing with the Economic Forum matters so much. The forum is supposed to communicate that Russia remains open for business, resilient under pressure, and stable enough for long-term planning. But investors do not only read speeches, they read risk. They read disruptions. They read how a state performs under stress. A city under drone alert during a flagship investment event sends a message far louder than any prepared panel discussion. An image matters in economics, because capital hates uncertainty. Even countries at war can still attract money, deals, and gray zone partnerships if elites believe the core system remains predictable. Predictability is the key word, not peace, not morality. Predictability, but deep strikes attack predictability. They ask, can flights operate? Can digital services stay up? Can export routes function without interruption? Can prestige sites remain insulated from war? Can state defenses guarantee calm around major events? If the answer to those questions becomes less certain, every other economic conversation becomes harder. It is also worth noticing how Ukraine frames these attacks. Kyiv often presents them less as terror and more as pressure on the machinery of war. Fuel, weapons, naval infrastructure, logistics, production. The language is important because it signals a campaign logic. The goal is not simply revenge. The goal is to narrow Russia's room to fight comfortably, make distance less useful, make rear areas more expensive, make military support systems feel hunted. This is why the phrase long-range sanctions resonates with some Ukrainian messaging. Traditional sanctions come from governments and financial systems. These strikes create a harsher version from the air. They try to tax Russian war capacity through fear, repair costs, insurance burdens, and disrupted routines. One method uses paperwork. The other uses propellers and fire. But both seek the same end, reducing Russia's ability to convert size into sustained power. There is another layer here that makes the attack feel especially painful for the Kremlin. St. Petersburg is woven into Putin's personal image. Leaders do not rule only through offices and armies. They also rule through places. Certain places become extensions of their biography. They carry emotional meaning, historical meaning, and symbolic ownership. So when a hostile strike reaches one of those places, it lands differently. It feels less like a distant battlefield update and more like a direct insult to the ruler's aura. That is why the title of this story really matters. A crown jewel is not always the biggest asset. It is the asset with emotional value, symbolic shine, and political meaning beyond its material worth. St. Petersburg fits that description. Kronstadt fits that description. A major forum staged there fits that description. Ukraine was not only hitting a target, it was hitting a self-image. And self-image is one of the most fragile parts of power. We often talk about tanks, missiles, factories, and sanctions. Those are real, but wars are also fought inside narratives. Who looks strong? Who looks exposed? Who seems to be adapting faster? Who appears trapped inside old assumptions? For much of the invasion, Russia tried to impose a simple story. It could hurt Ukraine at range while keeping its own core space relatively protected. That story is getting harder to maintain. Not impossible, but harder. Once a narrative starts cracking, every new incident widens the line. A successful strike on a distant oil facility says one thing. A strike on a naval site says another. A strike timed with a major forum says something larger still. Your geography no longer guarantees dignity. And that is dangerous for any leadership built on the language of control. Still, Russia will respond. It always does. Some response will be military. Some will be narrative. State media will minimize damage, stress interception numbers, and promise systemic retaliation. Officials will argue that this is exactly why the war must continue. Security measures will expand. Defenses may be repositioned. The Kremlin will try to turn embarrassment into justification. But even that response contains a kind of admission. Because the more a government explains why such attacks happen, the more it confirms that they can happen. The more it promises order next time, the more it reveals disorder this time. And the more it widens emergency measures inside daily life, the more citizens feel war moving inward. The key strategic lesson may be very simple. Ukraine is trying to make Russia spend the war not only on the battlefield, but inside its own idea of home. That is a profound shift. Home is where power rests, where elites gather, where trade is normalized, where prestige is staged, where routine becomes proof of order. Turn home into a place that needs constant emergency management, and you do not just create damage, you create fatigue. And fatigue accumulates, not always in revolutionary moments, often in 1,000 small losses. A rescheduled flight, a nervous investor, a commander waiting longer for repairs, a city official improvising around network cuts, a citizen realizing the war is no longer somewhere else, a leader forced to defend not just the front, but the image of the rear. That is how strategic pressure grows, quietly, repeatedly, without needing a single decisive battle. By this point, the biggest question is no longer whether Ukraine can reach deep targets. It clearly can. The bigger question is how often, how accurately, and with what cumulative effect. Because campaigns like this are not judged by one night alone. They are judged by repetition. If the same pattern continues, then Russia faces a long-term dilemma with no easy solution. Protect everything and spread resources thin, prioritize the front and leave prestige sites exposed, harden the rear and admit the rear is under threat. Every option carries a cost, And that may be the real brilliance behind these strikes. They are not only reaching far, they are forcing Russia to think far, spend far, and worry far. They stretch the war across geography, psychology, economics, and image all at once. A warship in dry dock becomes a symbol. An oil terminal becomes a pressure point. A business forum becomes a stage for humiliation. That is how modern drone warfare works, when used well. It does not simply destroy assets, it rearranges meaning. Quick pause before we go further. If this kind of calm, high-stakes breakdown is your style, subscribe now, drop a like, and share this with someone who wants analysis that stays with them after the video ends. So where does this leave Putin? Not defeated, not secure. Somewhere more uncomfortable than either word allows. He still controls a much larger war machine than Ukraine. He can still inflict enormous damage. He can still retaliate. He can still rely on censorship, messaging, and state power to contain panic. But he can no longer fully rely on distance. That is the key change. Distance was once one of Russia's greatest advantages. Its size made retaliation harder, logistics deeper, and symbolic centers feel insulated. Ukraine is not erasing that advantage entirely, but it is shrinking it. And once an advantage starts shrinking, planning must change. This matters for the military, because rear infrastructure is part of combat power. It matters for the economy, because export routes and investment confidence are part of wartime endurance. It matters for politics, because powerful leaders are judged not only by what they destroy, but by what they protect. And it matters for ordinary Russians, because every deep strike makes the state's promise of separation between war and daily life less believable. In a strange way, the strike says something broader about the future of conflict. Great powers used to trust depth. They believed important assets could be tucked safely behind layers of distance. But cheap drones, adaptive production, and persistent targeting are rewriting that rule. The rear is becoming porous. Prestige cities are becoming part of the battlefield. The cost of defending normal life is rising, and the side that adapts faster to that reality may gain an advantage that numbers alone cannot explain. That is why this moment matters beyond one city and one day. It shows how a weaker state, using range, timing, and symbolism, can pressure a stronger state in ways that traditional military logic did not fully anticipate. It shows that safe harbor is now a temporary condition, not a permanent one. It shows that economic image and military vulnerability can collide in the same morning. And it shows that one of the most valuable things in war is no longer just territory. It is the ability to shape what the enemy's people believe about safety. Putin spent years building the image of a leader who could impose order on chaos. Ukraine's long-range campaign is not just trying to burn parts of that order. It is trying to make the chaos visible where it hurts most. Not at the edge, at the center, not in rumor, in smoke, not in theory. During a major national showcase? That is why the St. Petersburg strike feels bigger than the fire itself. Because the real explosion happened inside a sentence Russia can no longer say with full confidence. The war is far away, and the important places are under control. After June 3rd, that sentence sounds weaker. And weakness in war is rarely announced. It is revealed. Revealed when a home city hears the conflict it was supposed to watch from afar. Revealed when a warship in repair is no longer resting in safety. Revealed when a glittering economic forum opens beneath a plume of smoke. Revealed when the state responds not with calm, but with shutdowns, delays, and explanations. Revealed when distance stops acting like armor. That is the deepest damage done here. Not only to an oil site, not only to a ship, not only to a schedule, but to an assumption. And assumptions are the hidden beams that hold strategy up. Once they crack, everything above them starts to shift. So yes, Ukraine hit infrastructure. Yes, it embarrassed the Kremlin. Yes, it exposed pressure points in the Baltic and in Russia's image. But the hardest blow may be this. It forced Putin to confront a future in which his most symbolic spaces can no longer be presented as sealed, calm, and untouchable. That is a military problem. That is an economic problem. That is a political problem. And above all, that is a psychological problem. Because power depends on people believing the ruler still has a firm grip on events. The moment that belief weakens, even slightly, every fire looks bigger, every delay feels longer, and every drone sounds closer than it did before. So when you look at St. Petersburg, do not just see a strike. See a warning. A warning that this war is moving deeper into the spaces Russia once treated as sacred. A warning that symbolism is now a battlefield. A warning that rear area confidence is being hunted with precision. And a warning that the next major question of this war may not be who can endure pain, but who can endure exposure. Because once the crown jewel has been touched, every other jewel has to wonder if it is next.